Hello and welcome to the
Most impressive.
Malgus-RP podcast. I am your host Iradox, and with me is my co-host Hirak.
Hello.
What the purpose of this podcast is to discuss RP-related topics. For instance, today we'll be discussing character development versus character archetypes. In future podcasts, we might also be discussing lore-related topics and take on guests.
We also... sorry.
Go ahead. We're just getting our coordination right here.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I can also, cut bits anyway.
No, leave it in. Go ahead.
We also decided to keep our character names, in the sense that we'll refer to each other as Iradox and Hirak as well, which we think will add a nice dynamic because of the fact that with all of our topics we can tackle them from a position where perhaps our characters might have a point of view, and also the sort of, I suppose, factions that they represent. So to add sort of like an extra depth to the conversation as well, it should be quite interesting.
Oh, well, at least you can represent the faction you represent, because mine just left his. But I suppose we both have a lot of bases on the Empire side, obviously. But we'll try not to be too biased.
At least not too biased. Yeah, we'll try and be as equal as possible.
Yeah, maybe drag on a Jedi later, see what they have to tell us.
Yeah, maybe if they're good enough.
If you're good enough, did you hear that? No. Anyway. So, as I said earlier, the topic of the day we'll be discussing is character development versus character archetypes. And what we mean by that is a character archetype, for instance, would be the idea of the perfect Sith or the perfect Jedi, or another character archetype of how they ought to be RP to portray, this character in an immersive and proper way, and how that sometimes are in opposition to character development that might divert from those paths, and how you can then fit that in and roleplay it in a way that doesn't, harm immersion of other people. And how you can still have fun with it, but also how you can avoid feeling that you're stuck in a character archetype, which limits your character development. So, what are your thoughts on that, Hype?
Well, to begin with, in all honesty, if we're talking about essentially archetypes and development, in my personal opinion, I think archetypes will always represent the sort of goal that a lot of characters will go towards. So in my mind, when I think of archetypes, I think of, for Sith especially, I always think about Darth Sidious, I always think about Darth Bane, and I also think about Exar Kun to a certain degree, because all those three for me represent a sort of a pathway, and a pathway towards something that my character might want to go for. So I know a lot of people, in all honesty, often those two really mix. But if we were to choose between perhaps development and an archetype, I suppose for me the most personal and probably the best example of that is starting off a character as a Darth and starting off a character as an Acolyte, at least in terms of Sith roleplay. Or, I suppose starting off a character as a Jedi Master, or as opposed to Initiate, or maybe someone who's been in Havoc's squad who actually should have been, your regular trooper. You'll have to forgive me, my knowledge on a lot of Republic side lore is quite lax. But in that regard, sorry, you go.
Yeah, so from what you're saying is that an archetype, like starting a character up in a high level, then you would be more of an archetype from your point of view, or what?
Well, in the sense that you kind of have to create this character as an archetype because of the fact that you have to liken it. I don't know, for example, I want my character to be a Darth, and I want it to be dark and brooding with a hood over his head, with deep red eyes, sort of who's been to the sacking of Coruscant, who's gone and done this. A lot of that is built off something that, for example, and it becomes one himself. Whereas maybe through character development, you get a character that isn't sort of your classic Mary Sue, a character that kind of is flesh and out, like one you might read about in a series of books, for example, like when you read about Bane, maybe. But that's my personal opinion.
So you feel that it's better to develop a character from the start, because then he becomes more nuanced rather than start out as an archetype that's on the top already and already have a lot of experience.
Exactly. I think with the archetypes, a lot of these characters do have special things about them. For example, I think if you take Exar Kun as an example, Exar Kun has a lot of lightsaber capabilities and was unbelievably good. And then when he switched to the dark side, he became even more of a force to be reckoned with. And it's these
with Sith sorcery, and so on.
Exactly. So with that in mind, it's hard to kind of play a character from an RP point of view, and take any enjoyment out of it for me personally, because what you've done is you've taken a character that already is so well established and you're just playing him down a flat line. Whereas with, I think, character development, you start at the bottom and there's this journey, and I think the journey is often more exciting, at least from me anyway.
Well, what I see, first of all, that a character that starts from the bottom and works his way up, or at least close to the bottom, is usually going to be far more nuanced and interesting character. In fact, I don't recommend people start role-playing as Jedi Masters or Dwarfs or even Sith Lords or Jedi Knights, even if they have a lot of experience. Because they're essentially going to start off as an archetype, as you say, and maybe write an interesting, a detailed background story will add a lot, but it will be artificial. However, I probably think about archetype differently than you do. For me, an archetype is more along the lines of what would a typical character in this setting be, and what do you do if character development, diverts from that? Because in my journey through SWTOR the last 6 years, especially in some of the earlier years, you would all characters that seemed very off from the setting that you were based in. For instance, I recall that I had a dwarf in a guild I was in at one point who stood in the tomb of Naga-Sadow, and then she was like, "Look at this! This is all the past failures." And I was like, "What? How would you get away with something like that, right?" Which didn't really make sense to me due to the society of the Sith and how it functions. So I think an archetype has something to do with what setting has your character grown up in, and how would they typically look as a result of that background, and how would they think, which is what I tend to base my characters when I start basing them. I start very low, like you recommend, and then I take all the stuff a character from this background would be and try to sort of fit them into the archetype, and then I let them flourish and develop from there.
It's that's definitely the best way for it. I think if we consider that the archetype from that, that a lot of what I think that one of the problems with Sith actually does spawn this, exactly as you say, sort of standing in front of Naga-Sadow and going, "These guys are failures. These are the worst. They're terrible." I think it does spawn an interesting point in the fact that would that actually be perfectly fine in that sort of Sith scenario? Perfectly fine to say these people were nothing in comparison to what we are now. Is that not part and parcel?
Yeah, but there's also the flip side of that, I think, because like if you take my own reaction at that point, which was, this doesn't make any sense, I feel that my immersion is broken, which then automatically, and I think from what I've experienced, when people break the archetypes and the expectations, you don't only get negative reactions from in-character, you also get some negative out-of-character reactions, because people expect you to act differently, and this doesn't make sense in this setting, and so on, which I was also and still am to a degree. And you get this too on the. Haven't role played a lot on the Republic side either. Recently I started, but from the Jedi role players I've been talking to, you get some Jedi role players are very tired of encountering a new Jedi or a Jedi Knight who then sort of alludes to they might have married at some point or so on, where the exceptions sort of become the rules, whereas the exceptions should be the exceptions. But then you also end up in a case of where does the character archetype end and your character development begin? Because if you have to stick to a certain archetype, the Dark Lord, the Darth, if your character reaches that point, or the Jedi Master or something, where's the fun in role-playing that if you're just sticking to the same mindset and you're not really allowed to divert for that because you have to show people what a proper Sith or proper Jedi role player is, which I know that a lot of older role players can tend to get stuck in. I was for a couple of years. I was reacting to, among other, the case I mentioned there, and I was like, well, now I'm going to show people how to role play a proper Sith, and then I didn't really allow my own character Iradox to develop out of that. He obviously has now, since he's sort of a heretic and left the Empire as a result of natural character development, but it can get very restrictive too. And sometimes I feel that people's reaction to it can be a bit detrimental to proper roleplay sometimes.
Yeah, no doubt. That's really interesting that you mentioned that, because one of the things I think you actually can, a way for you to sort that, where you don't have that sort of issue where your kind of character development comes in and archetype comes in. I think one of the most interesting parts of it is if you do start as an initiate, someone that low down. For example, if I were to take my character Hirak, he started off very much as not knowing anything, was joked about a lot, made a lot of fun of things, was vaguely happy to a certain degree, and got joy from a lot of places, and that sort of build of character that you've made over a certain period of time, I think that eventually can come into play and be shown when you're meant to be this archetypal Sith Lord, this person that rules over a certain power base, has a certain amount of people under them, and is genuinely terrifying in terms of battle strength and capability. For me, that comes out in a lot more casual roleplay, a roleplay where my character is talking to another one that they've known for a very long time. That kind of comes out because they can relax into that. And I think that's interesting. Where are the locations where, take for Iradox, for example, where would Iradox, when he was a Dark Lord, for example, where would he go? Where would be the point where he'd just suddenly kind of slip into this guy, when he was maybe 16 years old or younger, when that sort of personality came from?
Well, that's actually the fun part, because most of the time I played him as a Darth, he didn't. That was sort of a big flaw of him, because when I wrote the character, I wrote him with two very conscious flaws. I wrote him because I didn't want to, and I wanted there to be an option for him to slip out of being the perfect Sith, right? Or mess up somehow, or lose his way from that narrow road, which he has just ended up doing, right? One of them was he never really wanted to be a Dark Lord, because I did the whole he was a pureblood and his family died thing before it got cool, I like to say, when the game was still new and all that, and he felt I wanted to explore the whole aspect of bloodlines in Sith culture, because I felt that was an aspect of the Sith that isn't really explored much in the novels and stories, which then gave me some creative freedom. And I figured that it probably had to do with legacy and sort of the old Greek, the old Greek, what do you call it?
Oh, what, as in Kleos, you mean?
Yeah, Kleos, like the eternal, right? I can't live forever, but I can live forever through my legacy, right?
Yeah.
So he had all this responsibility shoved on to him, which then sort of forced him to choose between just living the life he actually wanted, and then becoming this thing that he was pushed to be, which he then ultimately decided to take that decision and sacrifice, the life he wanted, and then that became his everything. Because the more he sacrificed, the more he was spurred on to succeed, because he had sacrificed all of this, so he couldn't afford losing. So he could never afford letting his, drop his guard. So he became very isolated, very bitter.
Yeah.
But I still had that little opening that he didn't to be what he was. Of course he got a bit more into it as he went, but also that he had empathy. He wasn't a totally cold Sith. You have some Iradox's latest apprentice, whom Morik, for instance. He would be a very good example of a Sith who's sort of a psychopath, who doesn't really have empathy, and therefore is extremely good at the whole dark side thing, because he doesn't feel bad about it. It doesn't come natural to him. But Iradox actually has that, which the dark side, of course, tries to choke, but that gives an opening for switching paths and diverting from the archetype that he ended up living in for a time.
Yeah. That's very interesting. It kind of leads on to the point, really, that off the back of this sort of legacy and having to take over and become what you're expected to be. So, what would you say is the archetypal sort of idea of a classic Sith apprentice versus maybe what's the archetypal idea of a Jedi Padawan or a Jedi Knight? I'd be interested to hear your opinion on that.
Oh, I think that depends a lot on background.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, I think it's more in regards to a Sith apprentice. I think it makes more sense to ask where they're from. Are they a Sith pureblood who has been trained from birth to prepared for the academy and becoming Sith? It's sort of it's your destiny thing, which can also be counted for an imperial human. Or are you a former slave who's just sort of shoved into this and somehow you survived and now you're here? And that can mean a lot for your character's determination and where they eventually end up. I think one thing that's really typical of most of the Sith apprentices I've seen in the novels and also in roleplay is that they think too highly of themselves. They have received this big kick of power in the dark side, which makes them think they're immortal, but they're not. So some arrogance, you underestimate my power, and then you get your legs cut off, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Which my own character also had. I started as an apprentice fresh off the scene. I role-played with him was that he went to see his new master, and I started him out with all pureblood flaws. He was a sort of pureblood supremacist, which he later lost after few years due to character development, but he got to his new master and he literally, this is he thought it was an insult. This is insulting. What could you possibly teach me? And then he got zapped.
As you do.
Yeah. Jedi Padawan, I think it depends a lot on your background too, but I mean, especially in this era where the Jedi really need more Jedi to combat the Sith, so they might train children who's a bit older, which then that is probably where you can really get to explore the different, on. And I imagine that kind of character will struggle more with the whole there is no emotion part and no attachment and so on. Than a child who was taken when they were very small and has grown up in a temple or with a master.
That's interesting. I think for me, I very much agree on the apprentice side. I think it's a path where if you take, for example, going from acolyte to apprentice, there is a huge void in that where you've gone from being the lowest of the low, where everyone treats you like the worst thing ever, like you're literally bantha fodder, and then suddenly you've had a master, it doesn't matter whether they are the greatest one in the power base or not, choose you because of your talents. Like that arrogance is simply just the icing on the cake. And I think it's so important. But I think also another thing about it is an expressive ambition, and I think that's part of the archetype as well. Arrogance, ambition, obviously pride is in there as well, but there's also a shortcoming, and I think the shortcoming is the most important part about it, because the reason why you have a master in the first place is because of the fact that that you seek knowledge, and you seek knowledge not only to make your power stronger, but also the Empire. And I think that's quite a unique point about Sith from this era, is that you're not only, I think that's the important part, at least just, that kind of like aim to make the whole strong.
But okay, let's say that's the archetype for an apprentice, according to you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well then I'm gonna try and pull it apart if you don't.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, what if my character was sort of forced into the Sith, which they happen to do, and he somehow survived the nightmare that was the Academy, and now he's been picked by this guy as his apprentice. Really want any of this? He was sort of forced into it. So maybe he isn't really wants to get away, but he's afraid his master will come and kill him. So he sort of does what he's supposed to. That. And what if, the Empire slaughtered or enslaved his family? Maybe he doesn't give a shit about the Empire, and he hasn't really accepted all of the Sith knowledge, or maybe he's just accepted it to get revenge, and that way he gets dragged into the whole psychic effect of the dark side. Which is another thing I think is really important when you're playing a Sith, is to realize that the dark side isn't just, something you tap into on occasion. You can if you're really, really strong-willed. But generally, the dark side is corrosive and perpetual in the way that when you channel it, you become less irrational because you can become more emotional. It's not just like, I'm angry and now I'm fine. It also lasts longer, and over a longer period of time, it will affect you more and more, and you will change if you are to become more powerful. And it can be in subtle ways. Sometimes your character might not know they're changing.
Yeah.
But what I like from that example is that expectations might not always live up to the character, but I think that when people separate themselves from the archetype, they need a really good reason to do it, and I think in-character reason to do it, instead of just going, I'm special because I am. I'm against slavery because slavery is bad. I don't buy that if you grew up in the Empire. I buy it if you tell me that, your mom, she deserted at one point and now she's a slave. And you love your mom. Then I buy, okay, you're against slavery now, or you're sort of skeptical about it. Then I get it. Or you're a former slave, so you don't like slavery. Well, I can sort of buy into that. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
I think that's for certain, because I think at that point it's character development is greater than character archetype, because that makes sense. Like for example, let's take the slavery example. Your character has a family that has been enslaved. They might be from the imperial sector. They may have grown up in the Empire, but their family has been enslaved, and it's at that point that they might go, actually, this is wrong. And although it might not fit with how the Sith are, or whether or not they are Sith, it's still more the fact that in that regard they have a selfish desire, and that selfish desire is to make sure their family's okay. I think a lot of people tend to roleplay Sith where they are these almost emotionless, cold people, and I'm like, did not Anakin Skywalker fall to the dark side to save his love? Like, that is how majority of it is. Like, the dark side is selfish, and to say that you want to keep your parents alive and keep them going and take them away from slavery is just as good a reason to tap into the dark side as wanting to slaughter all beings in the universe. Like, that's the kind of great thing about it. It's not kind of like a sort of a mindless zombie. You are emotional. Like, that's what I think the Jedi are almost. The kind of zombie-esque.
Why the hell would you want to do that?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but I think another important thing when you're considering these archetypes is considering the culture and the general mindset of the society. For instance, a character who, just to stick to the slavery example, I totally get somebody from the Republic being against slavery. I'd get a Jedi being against slavery. I wouldn't get a character from, maybe a character from Nar Shaddaa and consider it morally wrong because, you know, it's a big multicultural place. So although it's sort of normal, maybe they don't really like it. But a character who's grown up in the Empire has no real interactions with people outside the Empire. So Empire suddenly shows up and say, well, slavery, I think it's wrong. I don't buy that because slavery is normal in the Empire, for instance. There has to be something influencing that. And I think a lot of it also comes down to how people express it and when.
Yeah.
I mean, how immersive it's going to seem.
Yeah, that's very true. I think in terms of the immersion sectors, it's you're very right. It's interesting because I think almost you can kind of say that a character that grows up from, like, take for example a character that grows up in Republic space, has grown up where everyone is free, and everyone has certain levels of standards. They then fall to the dark side. They become a Sith, and as a Sith, one would expect that them to be sort of iffy on the idea of slavery because they grew up in a Republic sector. They may not want slaves. They might have something else. They might consider them servants, for example. A prime example of this is my character Hirak and his colleague Tracton. They both of them were slaves, and whilst they are happy to enslave anything, what they do call their personal staff is more like a servant, someone who slightly better isn't treated in that regard, although they would happily treat them in that way. It's a slight a sort of divergence from it. But I think what is interesting is when, for example, you take someone who's grown up in a sector, a certain part of life, where everything points against what they should be feeling, but they in fact do feel it. So to take an example again, my character Hirak, he's an alien, a Rathataki, yet he's in a traditional house and believes in traditionalism, so he believes that aliens should be put down. His reasons are obviously his own, but he still believes that, and that's where you sort of like get an archetype. He's an alien Sith, he should be progressive, like a Cena, but in fact he's the complete opposite. And I think, does that break immersion? Would that break immersion in your point of view, Iradox, for example?
No, I mean, character there is cool, and if you get the impression the character developed there, the more power to it. It's more the case of if you have it come out of nowhere, or if you give the impression that it comes out of nowhere. For instance, you'll remember that your character's interaction with mine in the start, when our guilds interacted, I think it was you or maybe guys from Singularity that pointed out that Darth Iradox guy, he runs a meritocracy and he's very progressive. I've heard that from somewhere anyway. And he was a pureblood, you know, for most of the time until I decided to change that due to character development also. But I mean, he started out as a pureblood supremacist. He almost joined XLK as a pureblood's rebellion. I don't know if you were point.
I wasn't.
It was sort of a community thing. He made a few videos, which was essentially, you know, put the aliens back in chains. So he fought like that through most of his apprenticeship, and slowly changed, and a bit I thought a bit like it was too. But he ended up just, you know, having to face the fact that aliens can be just as smart and just as powerful. So he ended up instead adopting like a view where it was like, well, purebloods are generally better. You know, we have a bigger frequency of force sensitives being born, but there is an elite in all the other races too, and they're just good as us. You know, we're just talking about general populations not being as good. And at this point, you know, in his development, he's sort of totally done with that point of view. I mean, he ended up marrying a former slave, Twillick, so obviously he doesn't think like that anymore because of character development. So to answer your point, no, I don't think it's immersion breaking as long as the development is there, all the power to you.
Yeah. So I think in that regard, if, for example, someone was a traditionalist all the way through, and then for some reason, out of nowhere, just suddenly out of nowhere, they were like, actually, I'm so progressive right now, Like, for example, if you role-played with a character, and the character was like, I hate aliens, aliens should be under my boot the whole time, blah, 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 and then suddenly, out of nowhere, they were just suddenly like, you know what, aliens are great, I'm promoting this alien to Lord. That would be immersion breaking, because that came out of nowhere in that regard.
Yeah, but it didn't really come out of nowhere. I mean, if it's really just out of this traditional Lord guy wants to OOC promote his friend's character who happens to be an alien, then yes, then it's obviously wrong, and it's also OOC affecting in character. So, but in some cases, you might simply see something coming. An important thing to remember is that in very closed societies, especially in the Sith and the Empire, but also in the Jedi to a degree, I think it's dangerous to express your true opinions. Maybe you'll want to keep up a facade, if you see what I mean.
Yeah,
so
I do, yeah.
When you finally decide to break away from those things, maybe your character will switch from one point to another. Because maybe he has been changing, but he hasn't let anybody see it, because that's dangerous until he's sort of away from it. And then maybe he'll just...
Yeah, and then suddenly reveal it there and then. I get what you mean. I think it was more like, I meant more in the sense that if he was like just straight up traditional, no change, right, and then suddenly diversion, straight to progressive, out of nowhere, I suppose almost like flavor of the month, let's say. So yeah, that for me, I think that would be kind of strange. Maybe, but I think we could avoid. I think people tend to avoid that anyway. But I think that's quite an interesting one. People having characters at least, or characters existing in a plane that they shouldn't, but they somehow feel like they should. I think that's where I think character development gets you from, where you kind of like bypass the need to bypass that sort of way you should be there, in kind of the same way that like most people hate Dark Jedi nowadays, but a lot of people like to play Fallen Jedi or not, but a lot of the time they feel like they should be there, but they almost shouldn't really, to a certain degree.
You're pressured into not doing it, or what?
What's it? Sorry, say that again.
Are you saying that some people want to play Dark Jedi, but because of OOC, hatred towards Dark Jedi, they sort of avoid it?
I think there's a lot of people that will want to play a Dark Jedi, but then they can't shake the past. And I think that, for me, for example, is kind of bad. If we take the archetypical Dark Jedi, there's a lot of powerful ones out there, extremely powerful ones. But in most literature, you'll never really see them go, well, you were ex-Jedi? You know what, I'm going to hold that to you forever. Because that just doesn't happen. It feels like it's one of those things, at least that comes across icily in a bad light for me. Because, you know what, people were ex-Jedi, but that doesn't really make them any... I suppose it depends if you're an acolyte. If you're an acolyte, then fair enough. Like, you will be treated badly anyway. But if you're like a Sith Lord and you once were a Jedi, and you've turned and you've gone through it all and you've proven yourself, like, you're Sith now. It doesn't matter. At least in my personal opinion. I think it's an interesting...
Oh, so we're talking about Sith, Jedi turning Sith?
Well, just
because that's not really what I'm thinking. Dark Jedi, then I'm just thinking Sith, because in this era, Sith is very defined. I mean, it has a hierarchy and so on. So unless you're a Sith outside of the Sith Empire, which you can be, it's a belief after all. But if you go to... if your character is a full Jedi, they become a Sith apprentice, then a Lord or whatever, they're Sith. That's what I'm thinking, they're Sith. Specifically, it's stated in the game at one point that from the Sith point of view, there is no Dark Jedi, because all Force users must be Sith. That's the decree of the Emperor. At one point, I think it's on Balmorra Sith side, they state that in a quest. So Dark Jedi, to me, is more like Jedi going dark, or going rogue, or just leaving to... do their own thing, fulfill their own need. Argue that my character has become a Dark Jedi to a degree because he sort of just left the Sith to do his own thing, and he still uses the dark side. So
yeah, but I think
if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I know, I see what you mean. I think the issue is that if we consider Dark Jedi standalone, they are only standalone because a Sith Empire exists. If you take away the Sith Empire, if we go back, to Knights of the Old Republic, and you consider Revan and Malak, they were Sith. They were Dark.
Mhm.
It was almost kind of Rule of Two-esque, which we know kind of was derived from Revan's
From
hologram.
Revan. Yeah, well, yeah. That's
To a certain
Spain
degree.
putting his own spin on it, yeah.
Of course. But that's the interesting thing. And I think they were Sith. They very much were Sith. It's just in this era we have got a annoying. Obviously, the Sith Empire exists, so anyone outside of that can't be Sith, surely.
Oh yeah, they can.
Of course.
The Sith Empire probably wouldn't really view them as Sith, but they might view themselves as Sith.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a kind of a strange fallacy to a certain degree, because as you said, Sith is a philosophy. It just so happens there's a great bunch of them with a bit of Sith blood in them that form the Empire. And I think that's an interesting point to make, really. Sort of, where are they sort of like Dark Jedi scum or Jedi scum still, yet existing in a plane where they very much are Sith? It's an interesting one, but that's
I think that comes down a lot to the culture again. Whereas I think culturally they'd accept fallen Jedi, because you have examples in lore where, for instance, I think it was Darth Malgus' apprentice, who you see in the Annihilation novel, Darth Carrot, who she was an alien, and she became a Dark Council member for a time. She was a fallen Jedi, but she was very clearly a Sith Lord. And you have other examples in lore too of fallen Jedi becoming great Sith Lords, accepted Sith Lords. But again, characters might have a reason to disagree and still consider them Jedi scum, which is then fair if they have a way of justifying it.
Yeah, I suppose at the end of the day it boils down to, can you shut up the people who do call you Jedi scum? And I think that's probably it, really. Like, these people, these characters in lore that are Dark Jedi, I wouldn't turn around and call Revan Jedi scum if I was in his empire, because he'd just slap me.
Yeah, you mean from an in-character?
Well, from an in-character's point of view, I wouldn't do that. But whereas, for example, if you're an acolyte and your Sith Lord, like a Sith Lord turns around to you and goes, yeah, you're Jedi scum. Like, it's not like you can turn around and defend yourself. Like, you have to accept that. Then your peers accept that. And then you've got to fight that off in that regard, and it becomes a strange. I've seen it happen, and I think it's a strange sort of thing, but it's weirdly apt, and it really does bother you, because at the end of the day, nobody wants to associate with someone who used to be a Jedi. They've just got to prove that they are more Sith, and kind of obliterate that strange, I guess, reputation.
Well, I think it depends on your role-playing group too, because when I led the directive for 3 years, we had plenty of fallen Jedi on it. When we had room for them and we could fit them in, and that wasn't an issue. We had some of them become Sith Lords too.
Yeah.
Again, it's a case of, can you really show that you're a Sith?
Yeah, for certain.
But if we should reiterate our point, my thoughts on the whole character development versus character archetype thing is, stick to what makes sense in your setting, unless your character has good reasons to diverge for something, and then be open to character development. Of course, you can make a character who is a bit special because of something that's happened in their backgrounds, but only if it adds to the character, I would advise. Not that I'm your rule. I'm in any position to make rules.
Yeah, I think.
And don't seek to to stick out with your character development. But if it pulls you in that direction, remember that RP is about development, and don't let yourself be too. Don't allow the archetypes to trap you if it's not fun for you. Speaking from a guy who played a Darth for 4 years, I think, and ended up feeling that he had to stick within the borders of that archetype because he was leading a guild and he couldn't allow himself to go exactly where his character was pulling him. At the end of the day, it's going to kill your, will to RP. You don't have to impress people around you always. Just go with the character development that makes sense for you.
Yeah, and in my point of view, I think always character development will be above the archetype. If you can find a way where it works and completely fits in the setting, where people aren't essentially put off by what you have together, then that's always a positive. I think if you can create a Sith that exists in that plane of existence but isn't, for example, a progressive, like maybe they would be under a Cena, where they are maybe more traditionalist and can coexist with everyone else and still work perfectly fine without it being jarring, then that's perfect. And if that works in the way that you've developed your character through roleplay, even better. Interaction is the most important I suppose, experience for your character to develop and become more like how you think they should be as a Sith, or how you think they should be as a Jedi, or how you think they should be as a Grey Jedi, or whatever they become, bounty hunter, trooper. I think that's the most important interaction. But that that shouldn't scare you away from making an archetypal character, because at the end of the day, we don't roleplay the best of the best in the.
Be careful about preset linear progression, because you're going to find that at some point you'll end the end of the line and there's just no more.
Yeah.
And it's not fun. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't you agree?
Yep, I totally agree.
Yeah. Okay, well, that wraps up our discussion then. We'll try and have a podcast up again next month, or and then, well, maybe a bit sooner if we feel like it. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, definitely. If we've got the time.
Yeah, we'll figure it out. But if our discussion has sparked any thoughts, let us know in the comments. Tell us if you agree. Tell us if you disagree. Feel free to continue the discussion, and we'll see you next time.
All right, bye.
Bye.